The mysterious encounter. The battlefield was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos it had seen only hours ago. Smoke curled into the sky from the wreckage of vehicles and scorched land, and the faint hum of distant machines was the only sound that broke the silence. Alex, a war-weary human medic, moved cautiously through the ruins, his senses heightened by the lingering threat of danger. He gripped his medkit tightly, his eyes scanning for survivors. His unit had been ambushed, leaving him alone to navigate the wasteland. The sharp wind carried the faint scent of burnt metal and ozone, a smell Alex had grown all too familiar with. Each step felt heavier than the last, his body aching from exhaustion. Yet he pushed on. There might still be someone out there who needed help. As he approached a crumbled alien outpost, a faint, almost imperceptible sound stopped him in his tracks. It was a low, guttural groan, barely audible over the wind. Alex froze, his heart pounding. He crouched behind a piece of debris, his mind racing. Was it an enemy soldier, injured but still dangerous? Or was it another victim of this senseless war, clinging to life? Taking a deep breath, Alex crept closer to the sound. His boots crunched softly against the charred ground, and he tightened his grip on the medkit. As he rounded a corner, he saw her, a figure slumped against a broken wall, partially hidden by rubble. It was an alien, one of the enemy. Her skin shimmered faintly, a pale silver hue that reflected the dim light. She was tall and slender, with angular features that gave her an otherworldly beauty, though her face was twisted in pain. Her uniform, torn and bloodied, marked her as a medical officer. A nurse, Alex realized, judging by the tools scattered around her. Her breathing was shallow, and one of her arms hung limp at her side, clearly broken. For a moment, Alex hesitated. He had been taught to see her kind as the enemy, beings who had brought destruction and death to countless human colonies. Yet as he looked at her, he didn't see a soldier. He saw a fellow medic, someone who had likely been trying to save lives before the war consumed them both. "Can you hear me?" Alex asked cautiously, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. The alien's eyes fluttered open, revealing a pair of iridescent pupils that seemed to shift colors. She stared at him, her expression a mix of fear and defiance. She tried to speak, but only managed a weak rasp. "I'm not going to hurt you," Alex said, slowly raising his hands to show he meant no harm. He placed his medkit on the ground and knelt a few feet away from her. "I'm a medic. I can help." Her gaze flicked to the medkit, then back to him. She seemed to weigh his words carefully before giving a faint nod. Alex took it as permission and moved closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You're pretty banged up," he muttered as he examined her injuries. Her arm was indeed broken, and there was a deep gash along her side. Her blood was a dark blue, staining the ground beneath her. Despite the injuries, she seemed more concerned with something else, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows around them. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse but melodic. "Alex," he replied, pulling out a sterilized bandage. "And you?" "Phyla," she said, wincing as he began to clean her wound. "All right, Phyla," Alex said, keeping his tone calm. "This might hurt, but I need to stop the bleeding." Phyla nodded weakly, her breathing steadying as Alex worked. He couldn't help but notice the advanced technology integrated into her uniform, a stark contrast to the rudimentary tools he carried. Whatever species she belonged to, they were clearly more advanced than humans. "Why? Help me?" Phyla asked, her voice barely audible. Alex paused, meeting her gaze. "Because it's what I do. Doesn't matter who you are." She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher his motives. Finally, she closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. But before Alex could feel a sense of relief, a faint sound reached his ears, a distant hum that grew louder with each passing second. His stomach tightened. It was the sound of engines, likely alien patrols searching for survivors. "They're coming," Phyla whispered, her eyes snapping open. Panic flickered across her face. "You need to leave." "Not without you," Alex said firmly, his resolve hardening. He quickly finished bandaging her wound and looked around for something to use as a stretcher. Thyla grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so injured. "They will kill you. They will kill both of us." "Then we better move fast," Alex replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. As the hum of engines grew closer, Alex hoisted Thyla onto his shoulders, ignoring the protest from his own battered body. Together, they disappeared into the shadows, the first threads of an unlikely alliance forming between them. The uneasy alliance. The cave was dark and cold, its jagged walls offering little comfort but ample concealment. Alex carefully set Thyla down on a patch of dry ground, his muscles screaming from the effort of carrying her across the uneven terrain. His breathing was heavy, but his eyes remained sharp, scanning the entrance for any signs of pursuit. Outside, the hum of alien patrol ships echoed faintly, their searchlights piercing the gloom like hungry predators. Thyla groaned softly, her head lolling to the side. She was still pale, her silvery skin dulled by exhaustion and blood loss. Alex knelt beside her and checked the makeshift bandage on her side. It was holding, but barely. "You're lucky I'm stubborn," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on him with a mixture of wariness and confusion. "You, still here?" she rasped, her voice faint. "Where else would I go?" Alex replied, rummaging through his medkit. "You'd bleed out if I left you alone. Besides, I'm pretty sure those patrols outside aren't rolling out the welcome mat for me, either." Thyla managed a weak smile, though it quickly turned into a grimace as pain lanced through her. "Humans. Always so. Stubborn." "Yeah, well, it's kept me alive so far," Alex said, injecting a bit of humor into his tone. He held up a small vial of medicine he'd scavenged from her belongings earlier. "What is this?" "Painkiller. Antibiotic." Thyla hesitated, her gaze flicking between Alex and the vial. She seemed to be weighing whether to trust him. Pain and healing. Small dose. Too much. Dangerous. Alex nodded, carefully drawing a small amount of the liquid into a syringe. "Got it. Let's hope you're not allergic to humans trying to save your life." She didn't respond, her head falling back against the wall as he administered the injection. Within moments, her breathing steadied and some of the tension eased from her body. "You're not what I expected," she murmured, her voice clearer now. Alex raised an eyebrow. "What were you expecting? A knife to the throat? Maybe. Or to be left behind," Thyla admitted, her iridescent eyes studying him. "Your people hate mine, and we are no better." Alex sighed, leaning back against the wall. "Yeah, well, hate doesn't get us very far, does it? I've seen enough of this war to know it's all just noise. Doesn't mean I'm not angry about what I've lost, but holding on to it won't fix anything." For a moment, the cave was silent, save for the distant hum of patrol ships fading into the distance. Thyla's expression softened, and she closed her eyes as if to absorb his words. "Why were you out there, anyway?" Alex asked, breaking the silence. Not exactly the safest place for a medic. Thyla hesitated, her face shadowed with something Alex couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe. "I was part of a medical unit. We were supposed to provide aid to our soldiers. But I disobeyed." "Disobeyed how?" Alex pressed, his curiosity piqued. She opened her eyes, fixing him with a steady gaze. "They wanted me to assist in experiments. On prisoners. Your people." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed on. "I refused. They called me a traitor, sent soldiers after me. I ran." Alex stared at her, the weight of her confession sinking in. He'd heard stories of the horrors inflicted by the enemy, but hearing it from one of their own was different. It felt heavier. "Well," he said after a long pause, If it makes you feel any better, I think you did the right thing. Thyla looked at him, her expression unreadable. And now? I'm hunted. Like an animal. Not anymore, Alex said firmly. You're with me now, and I don't leave people behind. She blinked, clearly surprised by his resolve. For a moment, she seemed lost for words, but then she nodded, a hint of gratitude flickering in her eyes. Outside, the night deepened, and the distant sounds of the enemy faded entirely. For now, they were safe. But both Alex and Thyla knew it was only temporary. The war hadn't ended for either of them. It had just taken a more personal turn. As Alex prepared to set up a crude camp within the cave, he glanced at Thyla. She was already asleep, her breathing steady but shallow. He knew they would need to move again soon, but for now, he let her rest. They were two survivors, thrown together by chance, bound by a fragile thread of trust. The uneasy alliance had begun, but whether it would save them or lead to their downfall remained to be seen. Secrets unveiled. The morning brought little solace. Pale light filtered through cracks in the cave's walls, casting jagged shadows on the ground. Alex sat near the entrance, sharpening a knife he'd scavenged from a fallen soldier. His hands worked mechanically, but his thoughts were elsewhere, turning over everything Thyla had said the night before. He glanced back at her. Thyla was awake, leaning against the cave wall with a faraway look in her eyes. The bluish tint of her blood had faded from her skin, but she still looked weak, her silvery complexion dulled by exhaustion and pain. She held a small cylindrical device in her hand, fiddling with it absently. "Morning," Alex said, breaking the silence. "How are you holding up?" She looked at him, her iridescent eyes unreadable. "Better. Whatever you gave me, it worked." "Good," he replied, setting the knife aside. "We'll need to move soon. That patrol won't stay gone forever." Thyla nodded, but her grip tightened on the device in her hand. Alex noticed and leaned forward slightly. "What's that?" She hesitated before holding it out. "It's a beacon. For emergencies. If activated, it sends a distress signal to my people." Alex frowned, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "And you're thinking about using it?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "Not anymore. I thought about it earlier, but they won't help me. They'd kill me on sight." Alex leaned back, crossing his arms. "Then why keep it?" Thyla looked down at the device, her expression hardening. "Because it's a reminder of who I was, what I believed in." She paused, her voice growing softer. "And what I lost." Alex studied her for a moment. There was a heaviness in her words, a weight he recognized all too well. "What did you lose?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at the device, as if it held the answer to a question she couldn't put into words. Finally, she spoke. "Everything. My position. My people. My family." Her voice cracked slightly, but she continued. "When I refused to assist with the experiments, I didn't just defy my superiors. I defied my entire culture. They branded me a traitor, and now I'm nothing." Alex's brow furrowed. He'd heard stories of the enemy's ruthlessness, but this was something else entirely. "Why did you refuse?" he asked. "You could have gone along with it, saved yourself." She looked at him sharply. "Could you have done it? Stood by while innocent lives were torn apart?" "Because I couldn't. I joined the medical corps to heal, not destroy. What they were doing, it was monstrous." Alex nodded slowly. "Sounds like you made the right call." "Did I?" Thyla asked bitterly. "Because it feels like all I've done is trade one kind of death for another." The cave fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging between them. Alex leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're still here, aren't you? That means something. You chose to do the right thing, even when it cost you everything. That takes guts." She looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "And you? What have you lost?" Alex exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. My unit, my friends. We were sent here on a mission to secure supplies for a human colony. Got ambushed before we even reached the target. I was the only one who made it out alive. He paused, his jaw tightening. Barely. Phyla's gaze lingered on him, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. And you kept going. Why? He shrugged, his voice quieter now. Because someone has to. Because if I stop, then all the people I've lost, it's like they died for nothing. She nodded slowly, her fingers still tracing the edge of the beacon. You're different, Alex. Most humans I've met would rather shoot first and ask questions never. Yeah, well, most aliens I've met wouldn't be lying half-dead in a cave, hoping I don't finish the job, he replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. For the first time, Phyla chuckled, though it was a weak, raspy sound. Fair point. Their brief moment of levity was interrupted by a faint noise outside the cave, a rhythmic, mechanical thrum that sent a chill down Alex's spine. He immediately stood, motioning for Phyla to stay quiet. He moved to the entrance, peering out cautiously. In the distance, a scout drone hovered over the ruins they had fled the night before. Its sleek, metallic frame glinted in the morning light as it scanned the area. Alex's heart sank. If it found their trail, it would call in reinforcements. Trouble, Phyla whispered, her voice tense. Big trouble, Alex replied, stepping back into the shadows. We need to move. Now. Phyla struggled to her feet, clutching the cave wall for support. Alex moved to her side, slipping an arm around her to steady her. Think you can make it? I don't have much of a choice, do I? She said, her voice grim but determined. Together, they stepped out of the cave, their fragile alliance tested once again. As they disappeared into the rocky terrain, the scout drone pivoted sharply, its sensors locking onto a faint heat signature. The hunt was back on. The ambush. The sun was a dim, orange disk on the horizon, casting long shadows over the jagged terrain. Alex and Phyla moved carefully, sticking close to the rocks to avoid open areas. Every step was a struggle. Phyla's injuries slowed them down, and Alex's own fatigue was catching up. But the threat of pursuit kept them moving. The faint whine of the scout drone from earlier still echoed in Alex's ears, a constant reminder that they were being hunted. Keep low, Alex whispered as they approached a narrow ravine. Its steep walls would provide some cover, but it also felt like a trap, a perfect place for an ambush. He glanced at Phyla, who was clutching her injured side, her face pale but determined. She nodded, her voice barely audible. I'm fine. Just go. Alex wasn't convinced, but he didn't argue. They descended into the ravine, the air growing cooler and more oppressive. Rocks crumbled under their boots, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. This place doesn't feel right, Alex muttered, scanning the cliffs above. His instincts, honed by years of battlefield experience, screamed that something was wrong. Phyla's gaze flicked upward, her iridescent eyes narrowing. They're here. Before Alex could respond, the air erupted with sound and light. Energy blasts rained down from above, the harsh blue bolts scorching the ground around them. Alex grabbed Phyla and dove behind a boulder, narrowly avoiding the verge. Stay down, he shouted, pulling his sidearm from its holster. It was a standard-issue human weapon, primitive compared to the alien tech, but it was all he had. Phyla winced as she pressed her back against the rock, her breathing labored. They've sent a hunting squad. 4, maybe 5 soldiers. Elite. Great, Alex muttered, peeking out from cover. He caught a glimpse of sleek, armored figures moving along the cliffs, their helmets glowing faintly in the low light. They were coordinated, their movements precise. This wasn't a random patrol. They had been sent specifically for Phyla. One of the soldiers leaped down into the ravine with inhuman agility, landing with a heavy thud. Alex fired a shot, but the soldier's energy shield absorbed it effortlessly. The alien raised a weapon, its barrel crackling with electricity, and Alex barely managed to pull Thyla behind another rock as the blast disintegrated their previous cover. "We're sitting ducks here," Alex yelled over the noise. "Got any bright ideas?" Thyla's hand trembled as she reached for a small device on her belt. "I have something. It's not a weapon, but it might buy us time." Alex glanced at the device, a compact sphere with glowing runes etched into its surface. "What is it?" "A disruption emitter," Thyla explained, her voice tight with pain. "It'll overload their shields and comms, but it won't last long." Alex nodded. "Do it." With shaking hands, Thyla activated the device and rolled it into the open. A high-pitched whine filled the air, followed by a pulse of energy that rippled outward. The alien soldiers froze mid-movement, their shields flickering and their weapons sparking. One of them shouted something in their guttural language, but their comms were garbled and useless. "Now's our chance," Alex barked, pulling Thyla to her feet. Together, they bolted deeper into the ravine, dodging stray blasts as the soldiers struggled to recover. The terrain grew more treacherous, the rocks sharper and the path narrower. Alex led the way, his heart pounding as he searched for an exit. Behind them, the soldiers had regrouped, their shields restored and their pursuit relentless. "We won't outrun them," Thyla said, her voice strained. "They're faster, better equipped." Alex's mind raced. They needed a plan, something to level the playing field. His eyes fell on a narrow choke point up ahead, a natural bottleneck where the ravine walls closed in tightly. It wasn't perfect, but it was their best shot. "Keep going," he told Thyla, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll hold them off." She stopped, turning to face him. "You can't." "I don't have time to argue," Alex cut her off, his eyes fierce. "Just go. I'll catch up." Thyla hesitated, her expression torn, but she finally nodded. "Don't die, human," she said, a flicker of something almost like a smile on her lips. Alex watched her disappear around the bend before taking up position at the choke point. He planted himself behind a large boulder, his weapon ready. As the first soldier rounded the corner, Alex fired, aiming for the exposed joints in their armor. The shot hit home, and the alien staggered, giving Alex enough time to throw a grenade he'd scavenged earlier. The explosion shook the ravine, sending debris raining down. The alien soldiers hesitated, their formation disrupted, and Alex used the chaos to retreat further. But he knew it was only a matter of time before they adapted. Suddenly, Thyla's voice crackled in his earpiece, a piece of alien tech she'd slipped him earlier. "Alex, there's a ledge above you. Climb it. Quickly." He didn't question her. Holstering his weapon, he scrambled up the rocky wall, his fingers scraping against sharp edges. He reached the ledge just as the soldiers regained their momentum, their weapons blazing. From his new vantage point, Alex spotted Thyla further up, her hands working frantically on another device. She looked up and shouted, "Cover me." Alex grinned despite the danger. "Gladly." He fired down at the soldiers, his shots forcing them into cover. Thyla's device emitted a low hum, and suddenly the ground beneath the soldiers began to quake. A section of the ravine collapsed, cutting off their path, and sending two of them tumbling into the abyss. Panting, Alex climbed to where Thyla stood, her face pale but triumphant. "Not bad," he said, giving her a nod. "We're not safe yet," she replied, glancing at the remaining soldiers who were regrouping on the far side of the collapse. "But it'll slow them down." As the two of them retreated into the growing shadows, Alex couldn't help but feel a strange sense of camaraderie with the alien at his side. Their alliance, uneasy as it was, had held firm. But with the enemy still on their heels, he knew their fight was far from over. The escape plan. The cavern they stumbled into was vast, its ceilings soaring high above like the inside of an ancient cathedral. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth, and bioluminescent fungi cast an eerie glow over the rocky floor. The faint hum of their pursuers' drones echoed in the distance, reminding Alex and Phyla that their respite was fleeting. Alex leaned against a stone pillar, catching his breath. His body ached from the climb, and his mind raced with ideas on how to evade the alien soldiers. Across from him, Phyla sat slumped against the wall, her eyes half closed but still alert. Her silver skin glistened faintly under the blue-green light, but her movements were sluggish, and her breathing was shallow. "We can't keep running like this," Alex said, breaking the silence. "They'll catch up eventually." Phyla opened her eyes, fixing him with a weary but determined gaze. "Then we stop running." Alex frowned. "You mean fight? With what?" "A half-empty sidearm, and a grenade that might not even work." Phyla smirked faintly, reaching into the pouch on her belt. She pulled out a small rectangular device covered in glowing alien symbols. "We don't fight. We outsmart them." Alex raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "A holographic displacer," she explained, her voice weak but steady. "It can create a convincing decoy, a projection of us. But it only lasts for a few minutes, long enough to lure them into a trap." "And what's the trap?" Alex asked, intrigued despite himself. Phyla hesitated, her gaze flickering to the cavern's walls. "There's a natural fault line running through this chamber. If we can set off a controlled collapse, we can seal the path behind us and take them out in the process." Alex crossed his arms, thinking it over. "That's a big if. How do we trigger a collapse without getting buried ourselves?" Phyla gestured to a cluster of crystalline formations near the far wall. "Those are energy-reactive minerals. With the right frequency, they'll resonate and amplify, destabilizing the structure. My tech can generate the pulse." Alex glanced at the formations, then back at her. "You're sure about this?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "No. But unless you have a better idea, this is our best shot." Alex sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right, let's do it. But if this goes sideways, I'm blaming you." Phyla gave a faint laugh, the sound more like a cough. "Fair enough." Working quickly, they set the plan into motion. Phyla calibrated her device, while Alex scouted the cavern for suitable positions. He found a narrow ledge that overlooked the fault line, providing them with both a vantage point and an escape route, if they were fast enough. "You good up there?" Phyla called, her voice echoing slightly. "Good as I'll ever be," Alex replied, crouched on the ledge. He adjusted the sights on his sidearm, his finger hovering near the trigger. "You ready?" Phyla gave a sharp nod and activated the holographic displacer. A shimmering image of them appeared near the cavern's entrance, perfectly mimicking their movements. The projection made it look like they were limping toward the far wall, vulnerable and exposed. As expected, the alien soldiers weren't far behind. Their boots clanked against the rocky floor, and their glowing visors scanned the area. They moved with precision, their weapons raised, converging on the decoy without hesitation. Alex watched from above, his heart pounding. "They're biting," he whispered into the calm link Phyla had given him. "Wait for them to bunch together," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension. The soldiers advanced, their formation tightening as they prepared to strike. When they were directly over the fault line, Phyla pressed a button on her device. The crystalline formations began to hum, emitting a low-frequency vibration that resonated through the chamber. The soldiers hesitated, their movements faltering as the ground beneath them started to tremble. One of them shouted something in their guttural language, but it was too late. The fault line gave way with a deafening roar, and the ground collapsed beneath their feet, swallowing them into the abyss below. Alex grabbed Phyla's arm and hauled her onto the ledge as the cavern shook violently. Rocks and debris rained down, and a cloud of dust filled the air. The noise was deafening, but Alex barely noticed. His focus was on getting them both to safety. They scrambled along the ledge, ducking and weaving as the cavern continued to collapse. Finally, they reached a narrow tunnel at the far end, diving inside just as the entrance sealed behind them with a thunderous crash. For a long moment, there was only silence, broken only by their ragged breathing. Alex leaned against the tunnel wall, his chest heaving. "Tell me that worked." Thyla coughed, wiping dust from her face. "It worked. The path is sealed. They can't follow us now." Alex let out a shaky laugh, a mix of relief and exhaustion. "I can't believe that actually worked." Thyla managed a faint smile, though her eyes betrayed her weariness. "Never doubt an alien nurse, human." He chuckled, shaking his head. "All right, you've earned that one." But as the adrenaline began to fade, Alex's expression grew serious. "We bought ourselves time, but we're not out of the woods yet. What's next?" Thyla hesitated, her gaze distant. "There's an old relay station about a day's journey from here. If we can reach it, I can send a distress signal, not to my people, but to a neutral faction. They might help." Alex nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then that's where we're going. Rest up. We leave in an hour." As they prepared to move, both knew the stakes were higher than ever. Their escape plan had worked, but the war hadn't forgotten them. And the journey ahead promised to be even more dangerous. Redemption and sacrifice. The relay station was a ghost of its former self, standing alone amidst the desolation. It was a towering structure of alien design, its spires reaching skyward, though many were bent and broken from years of neglect. Alex and Thyla approached cautiously, their movements slow and deliberate. The faint hum of the relay's core was the only sign it still functioned, but even that sounded fragile, as if it could die at any moment. "This place gives me the creeps," Alex muttered, scanning the perimeter with his weapon drawn. The silence around them felt heavy, oppressive. He glanced at Thyla, who seemed lost in thought as she stared up at the structure. "It's an old outpost," she explained, her voice subdued. "Before the war, this station was a beacon of communication and trade. Now it's just forgotten." "Well, let's hope it's still useful," Alex said, motioning for her to follow. "We're sitting ducks out here." Thyla nodded, clutching her side as she limped behind him. They entered through a rusted hatch, the inside of the station dimly lit by flickering panels. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and disuse. "Stay close," Alex said, his voice low. "I'll clear each room ahead of you." Thyla didn't argue, falling into step behind him. As they moved deeper into the station, the faint hum of the relay grew louder, almost like a heartbeat. It was both reassuring and unsettling. Finally, they reached the central control room. A large console dominated the space, its screens glowing faintly with alien script. Thyla moved toward it immediately, her hands trembling slightly as she began to interface with the system. "How long will this take?" Alex asked, keeping his eyes on the entrance. "Not long," Thyla replied, her focus on the console. "But once I send the signal, it'll light us up like a flare. Anyone nearby, friend or foe, will know we're here." Alex grimaced. "Great. No pressure." Thyla worked quickly, her fingers flying over the alien keys. The console emitted a series of beeps and chirps, and a holographic interface sprang to life. She hesitated for a moment, then began to transmit the distress signal. "Who are you sending this to?" Alex asked, glancing at her. "An independent faction," Thyla said. "They're neither allied with my people nor yours. They don't fight in the war. They just help. And you're sure they'll come?" Alex pressed. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's our best chance." Suddenly, a sharp noise echoed through the station, a metallic clang that reverberated through the halls. Alex's body tensed, and he raised his weapon. "We've got company." Thyla's fingers froze over the console. "They found us," she said, her voice filled with dread. "No kidding," Alex muttered, moving to the doorway. He peeked into the corridor and saw them. The elite alien soldiers, their glowing visors cutting through the dim light like predatory eyes. They were moving quickly, their weapons drawn. "Phyla, how much longer?" Alex asked, his voice tight. 2 minutes, she replied, her hands shaking as she resumed typing. "We don't have 2 minutes." Alex snapped, firing a warning shot down the corridor. The soldiers ducked into cover, but their advance didn't stop. "Keep them off me," Phyla pleaded, her voice desperate. Alex nodded grimly, his mind racing. He moved to the nearest corner, using it as cover as he fired at the advancing soldiers. His shots forced them to slow, but their shields absorbed most of the damage. He gritted his teeth, knowing he couldn't hold them off for long. One of the soldiers lobbed a grenade down the corridor. Alex barely had time to react, diving back into the control room as the explosion shook the station. Debris rained down, and sparks flew from the walls. "Phyla, now would be a great time to work some alien magic," Alex said, coughing from the dust. "I'm almost done," she shouted, her voice shaking. The soldiers were closer now, their footsteps echoing louder with each passing second. Alex fired again, hitting one of them in the leg. The alien stumbled, but its comrades pressed forward, their weapons blazing. Suddenly, Phyla stood, clutching the device she had been working on. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. "The signal is sent." "Great," Alex said, firing another shot. "Now let's get out of here." Phyla hesitated, her gaze fixed on the soldiers. "We won't both make it." Alex froze, lowering his weapon slightly. "What are you talking about?" "They'll follow us, Alex. They'll keep coming until they get what they want." "Me," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Alex shook his head. "No, we're doing this together. I didn't drag you across half a planet just to let you give up now." Phyla smiled faintly. "It's not giving up. It's redemption." Before Alex could stop her, Phyla stepped into the corridor, holding her device high. The soldiers paused, clearly wary of her sudden appearance. "Go," she shouted at Alex, her voice fierce. "I'll draw them away. You need to survive, Alex, for both of us." "Phyla," Alex yelled, his voice breaking. But it was too late. Phyla activated the device, and a blinding light filled the corridor. The soldiers shouted in confusion as the energy disrupted their systems, giving Alex a chance to retreat. He hesitated, torn between saving her and following her last command. "Thank you," Phyla's voice echoed in his earpiece, "for showing me there's still good in this universe." And then the connection went dead. Alex clenched his fists, his heart heavy, but he forced himself to turn and run. The relay station crumbled behind him, the sound of collapsing metal and stone echoing in his ears. Phyla's sacrifice had bought him a chance. Now it was up to him to make it worth something. A new beginning. The dawn was a pale, fragile thing, casting a golden glow over the jagged terrain as Alex trudged toward the human outpost in the distance. His body was battered, his steps slow, but he pressed on, clutching Phyla's device tightly in his hand. It was all he had left of her, a small glowing cylinder that pulsed faintly, as if it held a piece of her spirit. The outpost loomed larger with every step, its high walls and watchtowers standing as a stark reminder of the war that had ravaged this world. Alex approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the perimeter. Human guards patrolled the walls, their weapons glinting in the early light. As he reached the gates, a loudspeaker crackled to life. "Identify yourself," a voice demanded, sharp and commanding. "Alex Carter," he called back, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "Combat medic, 3rd Battalion. I've been out here for weeks. I need to speak with your commander." There was a pause, and then the gates groaned open. 2 soldiers approached, their weapons trained on him. Alex didn't blame them. He looked like hell. His clothes were torn, his face was streaked with dirt, and his body bore the scars of his journey. "You're lucky we picked up your signal," one of the soldiers said, motioning for Alex to follow. We were about to write off this sector as a lost cause. Alex said nothing, his grip tightening on Phyla's device as he was escorted into the outpost. The bustling courtyard was a flurry of activity. Soldiers prepping for deployment, mechanics repairing damaged vehicles, medics tending to the wounded. It was a grim but familiar scene, one that Alex had lived through countless times. He was taken to the command center, a large reinforced building at the heart of the outpost. Inside, maps and tactical displays covered the walls, and a group of officers huddled around a central table, deep in discussion. The commanding officer, a grizzled man with a stern expression, looked up as Alex entered. "Carter," the officer said, his tone neutral but curious. "We thought we lost you and your unit weeks ago. What happened out there?" Alex hesitated, the weight of his journey pressing down on him. "They're all gone, sir," he said quietly. "Ambushed. I was the only one who made it." The officer nodded grimly, his gaze softening slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that, but you must have had a hell of a story to survive out there alone." "I wasn't alone," Alex said, his voice firm. He placed Phyla's device on the table, its faint glow catching the officer's attention. "I had help. From her." The officer frowned, leaning closer to examine the device. "What is this? Alien tech?" Alex nodded. "It's a piece of her. A nurse from the other side. She saved my life more times than I can count, and she gave up everything to make sure I made it back." There was a murmur of disbelief among the officers, but Alex didn't care. He wasn't looking for their approval. He was here to fulfill a promise. "She wasn't like the others," he continued, his voice steady. "She wasn't a soldier. She wanted peace, not war. And she died proving it." The officer leaned back, his expression unreadable. "And why are you telling us this, Carter?" "Because there's more out there," Alex said, his eyes blazing with determination. "People like her. People who don't want to fight anymore. We've been so focused on destroying each other that we've forgotten there's another way." The room fell silent, the weight of Alex's words hanging in the air. The officer studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll see to it that this device is analyzed," he said. "If it holds any useful data, we'll use it. As for the rest," he sighed, his voice softening. "You've been through enough, son. Take some time to rest. You've earned it." Alex nodded, though rest was the furthest thing from his mind. He left the command center and wandered through the outpost, his thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. He felt Phyla's absence keenly, but her presence lingered in every step he took, every breath he drew. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Alex found himself on the outskirts of the outpost, staring out at the endless expanse of rugged terrain. He thought of Phyla, of her courage and sacrifice, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had believed in something better, and now so did he. Epilogue. A signal from the stars. Days later, as Alex worked in the outpost's medical bay, a commotion erupted in the control room. A strange signal had been detected, faint but undeniable, originating from deep within alien-controlled territory. Alex's heart raced as he heard the news. He made his way to the control room, where the officers were gathered around a monitor displaying the signal's pattern. It was unlike anything they had seen before. "That's her," Alex whispered, his voice trembling. "That's Phyla." The officer in charge glanced at him. "How can you be sure?" Alex didn't have an answer, but he felt it in his gut. The signal pulsed steadily, almost like a heartbeat. It was a message, a beacon of hope, and Alex knew he had to follow it.